All right, this is the Gateway API meeting for March 21. If you have not been here before, just a reminder that this is a very rough agenda that we go through, of course, and anyone, and I mean anyone, can add things to this agenda. There are things that we should talk about. Please make sure that you fill this out. You can do it at any point. This doc should be something that anyone can edit. This is a very informal meeting. There are no stupid questions at all. So please, if anything doesn't sound right, or if you have any questions about what we're saying, please, by all means. With that, let me go ahead and jump into, well, actually, Mike, I think you started on a topic, maybe. Did you have anything you wanted to add here?
There's one more thing I wanted to say.
Okay.
Before we get started, yeah, if you haven't been before, if you haven't come to the meeting before, please feel free to drop a hello in the chat, or unmute and say hi. Yeah, like Rob says, this is a pretty informal meeting. It's great to see heaps of people coming. But yeah, and I think both Rob and I have spent a long time working on this and can talk for a long time about it, and will, unless we have reasons not to. So yeah, don't feel like Rob said, there's no stupid questions. Absolutely not. And please unmute or raise your hand if you have a question or you want to ask anything at any point, or put it in the chat if you don't feel comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points.
Rob, I think that Mike is actually, I actually was just copying and pasting from the beginning of last month's meeting to get the date and the bullet points. So I think that was just me not having eliminated that yet. Makes
sense. I completely understand.
There.
Thank you for setting this up. It took me to the last minute to actually add today's entry. So yeah, glad you added it there. With that, yeah, maybe we can head straight into the V1 Beta 1 milestone. This is really top priority for me anyway, and I think for most of us, it's just trying to get a V1 Beta 1 out the door. We feel awfully close. If you have looked at the milestone recently, we're churning through issues. We've closed a few, and many of the rest are assigned to someone now. So it feels like we're in a reasonably good place. If you look at the kinds we're seeing here, there's almost exclusively documentation left and some webhook stuff. But there are a couple features that are kind of on the edge here, and I wanted to talk about those. So first up, there's the discussion about port ranges and all ports. And this is something that had come up in the previous API review. I think it was Tim may have raised it. I don't know. It was raised by a few different people of how could we support all ports? How could we support port ranges? These kinds of things in the future. And the idea was that we should at least have an answer for how it could work when we get back to the next round of API review, which in this case will be for beta. So we've had good discussion throughout here. I added a doc that we reviewed at a previous meeting. It seems like we have a good path forward that does not require breaking changes, that allows us to support all the potential use cases, and can be added after beta. So that makes me think that this specific thing does not need to block a beta release. But I wanted to just kind of open this up, see if anyone felt more strongly that we should hold off on beta, or that this should not block. Anyone have thoughts about port range and what we need to do before beta?
Rob, is there a specific set of choices? I think we had some discussion that.
Yeah, so
like what the choices were.
Sure. So I mean, basically, I have a proposal here that shows a way where we could basically mirror verbatim what network policy did as a backwards compatible approach that would solve the use cases that I have presented here, but that this approach, one, we don't need to commit to it, and two, does not need to block beta. So that's my proposal. I haven't really provided much in the way of alternatives. I'm just looking for confirmation that that is a reasonable step forward. Or if anyone has any hesitancy, this would be a great time to raise that.
Well, this is John. I wrote a note in there, and I thought about this over from the last meeting, and it just may be my different viewpoint. Is Gateway API tightly coupled to having a proxy? This is where the port listener construct really comes from. If I have a proxy, I've got to have a port listener. I've got to have a listener with a port attached to it. And I kind of put a use case in, over the weekend, that's trying to show, maybe ask the question, if Gateway API is tightly coupled to proxy, then okay. If it's not tightly coupled to proxy, it can be more. The example I put in was like AWS has this thing called a gateway load balancer that basically says, hey, just send things to it and it acts as a network service. And then it does things and sends them back to you. And the sort of vision or the hope I had was I could use Gateway API to implement that generic sense for Kubernetes. Am I making sense or just,
Yeah, no, that made sense. Your use case made sense to me, John. And I think it is fair to say that most of the implementations that have implemented Gateway API up to this point have used a proxy. But when we were talking about the initial constructs, we tried to make it that in general, like I think most of us were thinking about mainly kind of load balancer kind of things, which sometimes proxy, sometimes don't, right? But they all have this idea of a listener with a port. And so that's, I think the load balancer idea was really what informed a lot of the things that we talked about Gateway API. That said, I think that your points are super fair, and that it should be possible. The gateway idea originally is intended to describe a thing that, like the boundary at which your network traffic goes from things that don't know about the cluster to things that do know about the cluster networking. And so like the use case that you have, like I think that's pretty fair. The outside bits don't care about the fact that this is in line, and the inside bits do, obviously. And I've talked before about having like maybe something like an IP route to describe GRE tunnel, or like a GRE route to describe GRE tunnels and that sort of thing. That would also require like not having a port. I do think that the thing that Rob has in there is about like a port being auto assigned, like doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Like I think that maybe that will probably end up being, I think that there were some other questions raised in one of the other issues in one of the other comments there about if we do have ports be dynamically assigned, how does that work? I feel like a lot of design work needs to happen there for us to be able to be like, okay, if you're doing stuff that needs a port, you may assign a port, and if so, here's how it works. If you're doing stuff that doesn't need a port, then here's what you do. I've also noticed feedback a couple of times before that the gateway constructs we've got describe like a lot of networking concepts really well, and so a lot of people want to take them and use them to describe other networking concepts. Like we've talked before about replacing the gateway object as like the key object that you spin around with maybe a sort of putative mesh object to handle some of the service mesh use cases and stuff like that. And so it may be the gateway we have now. Like I think there's a few things that we could do here, but off the top of my head, I feel like the use case that you've supplied sounds pretty reasonable. Although it seems like Rob and Bowie both had things to say.
So Rob, I think this is the issue that's related to it. Sorry, I'm just reading through it.
Yeah, this is the use case. Yeah, so if I were to summarize this in another way, it's this is using a gateway to describe the routing setup that you would have, like thinking back to the days when we had racks and like things like that. Like this is like our DMZ routing setup, right? Like you're saying for stuff that comes in that looks like this traffic that matches these listeners and these routes, route it off to a DMZ service. That DMZ service does some filtering or something and then sends it back to the implementation. And that
I see. This is more a transparent. It's like a transparent proxy in some ways.
Yep. Yeah. Both. Yeah.
transparent filter is probably a better way to say it than a transparent proxy.
Yeah. It could be enhancer. I mean, you can imagine people doing things to modify data and the way through, and you can, even just doing security, adding encrypt and decrypt services, any type of service you want to implement that is transparent, right? It may end up modifying data in some way or applying policy to data, to the flows.
So the use case you're talking about, though, I don't think it would really be covered by any of the existing route objects. Maybe TCP.
Maybe TCP, maybe UDP, yeah. But
like
maybe you want to extend them to be more maybe UDP Geneve, UDP VXLAN that has additional metadata in them. Might be.
I feel like the matching criteria we have available on TCP route and UDP route is not advanced enough to be able to describe the sorts of things I would want to do with a thing like this.
Yeah. I can imagine you still doing TCP options fields.
But I think that
I think like there's two pieces to this. One is that as currently structured, does the gateway API CRD give you the right kind of description? And then of course we do say that one of the nice things about splitting the route from the gateway side of things is you're free to actually go implement your super duper route for TCP as an experiment just to see, and you can still use the same mechanisms for association, putting things across namespaces, like attaching policy, like all the stuff is still reusable. And that one can be done without even talking to upstream, just to see like, oh, does this API make sense in that situation? But the key would be that is there any impact on the API as specified from the gateway standpoint to make it possible for you to do this?
Yeah. So if I can answer what I think it is, John, and you can correct me, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that if there's some way that you can say no ports, then that's really what you need to, that a listener can have no ports, then that would be what you need. And I think in Rob's proposal, it's kind of like no port specified implies for like HTTP or TCP use cases implies auto assign me a port. But the point that John is making is that no port specified can actually mean no port specified. We don't actually want a port. The port is not important.
Or it's all ports. You're not. You don't have listener, I think is the.
I mean, so
I see. Interesting, because we did have a proposal about how to match everything just to an IP.
Yeah.
Which is like the all ports or something.
Yeah,
all
ports is fairly straightforward to represent. It's just you define a port range that is inclusive of all ports, right? That's possible without that kind of nil or empty port.
So I think.
Go ahead.
And the one thing I would say there is, John, you said like you don't need a listener. I think that in this case, like listener is kind of not a good word, but it kind of means that this is the point that you attach the routing to. This is like the bucket criteria. And so like maybe the point that Costin made in the chat is fair, that maybe we might be better to address that use case with a custom gateway style type. But I think that Rob's point that we've got that his proposal provides a way to represent all ports. Maybe you could use that and sort of try it out. You're right. Both just making this and everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think some other constructs in Kubernetes, they have max and min for the port range. You just put 1 to 65.
Yeah. So I think Rob's proposal is that the existing port field be made optional, and then it becomes, if you specify an end port, then it becomes the start. Then the existing port field means start port. So instead of having maximum and minimum, we just have port and end port, with end port being optional, and that way the existing implementations don't need to change a lot. They just need to handle the case that port is not defined. but like then you get the sort of all ports functionality like for a relatively low cost. And the good part is that, as Rob said, and the reason that he proposed this not blocking beta is that making a required port optional is not a breaking API change. Adding a new optional field is not a breaking API change. So both of those changes are not breaking API changes. So we can do them after we go to beta. And that's the point that Rob was trying to make.
Yeah, I mean, I put the use case in mainly for my own sanity to make sure what I was thinking of doing, you guys didn't think I was completely nuts and it was not possible.
Yeah. No, and I really appreciate the use case. Sorry, Rob, I've talked too much. You go.
No, I appreciate it too. I really want to encourage additional use cases. You're right that so far the maintainers of this project have been pretty focused. You know, we mostly come from backgrounds where we're implementing and or maintaining ingress implementations of this API. We want to be very aware that this API is and can be broader than that, but we're not as, you know, aware of these other potential use cases. So seeing them is very helpful. I'd also echo Bowie's point earlier that this API is very much meant to be pluggable, right? So we have these kind of patterns, these components, these things that really can be put together like Lego pieces or whatever to build your own route, to build your own gateway, if that be the case. I hope that everything can fit into the pieces we already have. But if you want to experiment with, could this work if I made this change to TCP route? By all means, that's very, very much encouraged.
Thank you.
Great.
I think Costin, before we move on, I think Costin had something they wanted to add. Nope. Cool.
Jeff, maybe?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I can see there's a lot of times when users might need either multiple ports, port 80 and 80, just as an example, or they might need a range. Of course, as just talked about, we use the being optional could indicate auto assign or not relevant or something. But it seems like just having a set port and a endpoint, so you really only support a single port or a range of ports, is a little limiting. I've certainly got a fair number of customers that need to expose multiple ports for an application.
That's a very real use case. The early days of the API, we went back and forth between, I feel like, 10 different variations of gateway, right? And the thing we know of listeners today was once, I think, really just a list of ports. And then, oh, well, maybe we can, so it's all trying to find the right abstraction layer. Listener was really meant to be a initially like this mapping between port and protocol. And so if you have additional ports you want to listen to, you create a new listener. And here are the routes that this port and protocol support. I think that's still possible, but you're right that especially if we blur these lines further and we say, actually, a listener can support multiple ports now. Now it's not so much a list of ports and protocols, it's within that list, you can have multiple ports per item, which changes our initial assumptions some, for sure. I guess that doesn't directly answer your question other than to say that that is a very real use case. And it seems possible today. It seems possible today, but just adding port ranges in general blurs the line of how you represent more than one port. Because right now the answer is you just add a new listener. And now we're providing two answers.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Any other comments on port here?
It does feel like nothing we have discussed keeps this at a block at blocking beta status though. Sorry, Bowie.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is that the most important thing is we make it optional now because that gives us the greatest amount of flexibility later.
I could see that. And so the problem is if we make it optional, we have to define what it means when port is nil, which we have not done yet. That's a fairly important.
We haven't defined what it means when port is 0 yet either.
Well, fortunately, we've avoided that because we set a min validation of 1. So we've just blown past this whole thing by saying it's required and it has to be a valid, 1 to 65, whatever. If we make it empty, we have to define, does that mean it's automatically assigned? Does that mean nothing? Does it to me, it feels like the safest thing to do is actually nothing. Just to say this is a path forward. We can pursue it in the future as use cases are clarified.
There's another alternative, which is just like how we defined out 0, is to have it not be possible to be nil, but the schema is nil, allows a nil.
Right? Yeah. I mean, that would mean you give it a default, right? Because if it's nil, then it's by definition optional. So you need to.
Oh, I see. Is that how the CRD?
I don't know if you can make a required pointer type. I don't think you can.
I see.
Yeah, you can't make a required pointer type. Costin.
In that case, though, wouldn't it be disallowed because the default would be 0? Never mind.
Anyway, Costin was next.
We can't hear you if you're saying something.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So RFCs typically have some semantics of what happens if you don't specify a port. So and missing port for HTTP, for example, means 80 or 440 with HTTPS, and most protocols have default ports. It's better not to deviate too much from, internet practices, and also 0 typically on Unix means that automatically allocate a port. So maybe we should align with the internet and RFCs a bit. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like maybe the answer there is when we do it to say, if port is nil, then the port is defined, then the port should be picked by the implementation based on the protocol. I think it is important so one of the discussions that we've had on that issue is about dynamic port allocation and being able to say, but we need to think really careful about that, because if we do something like what Costa says and we say, if you set the protocol to HTTP and you don't specify a port, then the port is 80, then that means that some implementations will expect that you can merge multiple listeners that have protocol HTTP and no port specified, or that specify HTTP protocol and port 80 because those are equivalent. That means that we have to be a little bit more clear about what constitutes mergeable listeners and what doesn't. Which I think is fine. We should be very clear about what constitutes mergeable listeners and what doesn't. But yeah, we just need to make sure we make that set of rules pretty ironclad. Sorry, Costin, do you have more?
Yeah, no, just to answer a bit what you said. Yes, I mean, for HTTP, for example, I don't think we have too many cases of dynamic port. For RTP, we definitely have, and so maybe protocol dictates what the semantic of port is, because for if WebRTC, for example, is all dynamic ports, then the semantic of port is what WebRTC defines. For HTTP, HTTP spec defines what is the default port and what it means you don't have the port. So basically, by FTP is a dynamic case, so it's probably better to align the use cases with the protocols and what they are used for, not to generalize for all protocols to use the same semantics.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair, and I think that. I also thought of the same thing when you said FTP, Costin. I was like, people still use FTP. But anyway, aside from that, I think the defining it based on the protocol is feels like a pretty fair way to do it. Because then it's like, okay, then we have to have, I mean, obviously the obvious corollary there is if we do that, then we have to have like, you know, the conformance tests and stuff to say this is how the behavior works for specific protocols. Because, you know, as you know, we've got specific protocols are available as values in the listener. Anything outside those values is a implementation specific support. So it will never be covered by conformance tests. And so, yeah, I think that would be the way that we would make that work in my mind. Sorry, Jeff, over to you.
I was just, I was thinking that, you know, maybe the way to leave it for now is change it so that it's an optional, and the way it's done, the specified behavior is implementation specific. But the more, as I've been listening, the more I think about it, I think that's not a good option. Because I definitely would not want to see us say that unspecified means it defaults to, you know, port 80 or 443 or whatever it is. Because I think we do want to allow for a non-provided value to represent something as either, you know, an auto-assigned port, or maybe a use case where the port isn't relevant. You know, like Nick, like you mentioned, you know, like pointing to a GRE route or something like that, where it's not really relevant. So it's my thought.
Yeah, I'd agree with that statement too. Just as much as it's tempting to go to optional port right now, I think that's actually a dangerous precedent to set. It opens a door to all kinds of undefined usage. And we're not saying we would actually define what that means. We either leave it implementation specific or come up with a definition that meets some subset of use cases. I think what we need to be very clear about with this API is that we reserve the right for fields that are currently required to become optional in the future. And we can highlight that very clearly, that port is likely going to become optional in the future. Guard against that. But that is very much, I think that's already written into our, you know, API versioning guidelines, that a required field today may become optional in the future. And that allows us to, one, leave the field required, because there's a chance we may not move forward with any of this, or there's a chance we'll move forward with a subset. The subset is just port range, and port range itself does not require a nil or optional port. It could just be a required value as the base. So my strong preference here is to leave the configuration as is and document, again, just another reminder that we reserve the right to make a currently required field optional. But anything else we do.
Doesn't that break compatibility though? I'm just
that is explicitly
trying to understand
allowed.
this.
That is explicitly allowed if by the upstream API change guidelines.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Required port optional is okay because so it comes down to because of storage versions and serialization and stuff like that. Like you can round trip a port that was required can round trip into the storage version where it was required and then come back out to one where it was optional and still be valid no matter what.
Yeah,
right. That makes sense, even though it's very counterintuitive.
Yes, and it is very strange and awkward. And the way they do it in upstream is they do a version gate, you know, a feature gate, and it rolls out over like 2 Kubernetes versions. We don't have quite the same level of flexibility, but it is very much, you know, something that happens upstream.
Yeah. Yet, actually, I need to add that to the agenda. Give me a second. Yeah. So yeah, I agree with Rob. I think that for beta, I think this is a complicated enough thing that we need to sit down and talk about it properly. I would definitely encourage Costin to if you could write up something about like some of the use cases you're thinking of, just so that we have an issue with the use cases written down. That way we can talk on the thing and get clarity on those. That would be really helpful.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I think that would be really good. And anyone else who has like layer 4 use cases that, I think that we need to have like an issue for like dynamic allocation of ports, one for like ports that require protocols that require ranges, and those just as separate like use case issues so that then we can all agree on like what it means to require a range and what it means when you're doing a dynamic one, so that we can then be all on the same page. And then when we're doing the design, we can all make sure that we're thinking about things in the same way. Because it's one of the things that I have learned throughout this process of designing. A surprising amount of the time when someone says dynamic port allocation, they mean something completely different to what someone else says when they say dynamic port allocation. So it's good to make sure that everybody has agreed that you're on the same page by someone writing down, this is what I mean when I say dynamic port allocation.
Yes, on that note, in my last comment on this bug, there were two interpretations of dynamic port allocation covered by two separate docs, and I didn't even realize they were different until was it John that pointed out that these are, or Mark pointed out these are different things. Anyway, so I completely agree. Need to be careful here. I think we have a lot more on the agenda, so I do want to get to it. What I think I'm going to do here, I've left this comment.
So finish that up, but I think there's one more thing that we need to talk about. That
okay, sure.
in the chat. Yep.
Sure. So I left this comment on issue 818. I'll let this sit for around 24 hours. And if you have any other hesitation, anything you want to bring up specifically about if we should block beta on this, if there's something in here that we want to change before beta, add a comment on this. This is 818. Otherwise, I'm going to, around 24 hours from now, if I don't hear from anyone, I'll plan on removing this from the beta milestone and consider it something like that we're fine with leaving for a future release. But with that, Nick, I think you had one more thing.
Yeah, so it's actually two more things. One thing that Bowie made a point before about the status. I think that no matter what we end up doing with port being not required in the thing, that if an implementation assigns a port, it will show up in the status. That's the if there is a port relevant to the listener and that the implementation is using, it should be in the status. So if we end up doing port optional and you supply HTTP and your implementation decides that means port 80, then that port 80 will be listed in the status for that listener, right? So that's why the status has a port, so that if you are looking at how this thing should be working, you can look at the listener status and you can say, okay, this listener has this port no matter what is in the spec. Okay, so I think that's one thing that we need to clarify. The other thing was that Lewin was asking, like, is there another way, because a HTTP route can have multiple parent refs, maybe you can just, if you want to have a HTTP route have listen on multiple ports, then you can have the HTTP route refer to the same gateway with different section names, with different listener names, to make it work. Yes, and I think that's 100% right. That will work. It's a little unusual because, but like, I'd also like to remind you that currently the way that the attachment process works is that if you don't specify a section name, your route should attach to all listeners. So that's the expected behavior, is that if you don't supply a single listener name to attach to, then your route, when it lists a gateway as its parent ref, should expect to attach to any listeners present in the gateway. So if you have a HTTP route that you add to a gateway that has a HTTP and a HTTPS thing, it's kind of expected that there'll be something will happen for your route for both HTTP and HTTPS. I think there's probably some room for us to tidy that up a bit, but that's the kind of, in my mind, the current expectation. Just wanted to make sure that stuff was clear.
Great clarifications.
Cool. Okay.
All right, let's move on because we do have not enough time, but I do want to get to Re-Encrypt because Nick, you brought this up, and also Harry had mentioned this as something that could potentially be a blocker of V1 Beta 1. And I'm just, again, trying to run through anything unexpected that could block us and take a longer time than just documentation or something. In this case, the question is that our documentation, I believe this is still accurate. Our documentation says that for HTTP route, TLS can be terminated plus re-encrypted. And the confusion here is that we don't provide any mechanism within the API to handle that re-encryption from gateway to backend. And so at a minimum, these docs are confusing. On the other side, maybe we should be thinking about adding some kind of built-in core support or extended support.
Wait, Rob, I'm a little confused because I thought we look at the app protocol.
So yeah, so what happened was we removed the backend policy resource in V1 Alpha 2. And backend, I was looking at this just right now, and backend policy is where we had put in a TLS section, which was the TLS between the gateway to the service hop, the upstream hop. But we removed that resource because we have reference policy and X policy, you'll have X resources.
I guess, and there's also app protocol, which does let you get this information.
If you're,
so I think Costa has his hand raised.
Yeah, one thing to mention is that for re-encryption is not only that it's re-encrypted, but it's also what SUN to expect on the other end, what root certificate. So it's a bit more complicated than just that.
Yeah, great. So there needs to be a stanza that holds the TLS details for the gateway, whatever, however it's implemented, to be a client that connects to the backend service, and that's the key part that we need to have, like an upstream TLS details stanza that specifies, like, here's the certificate to use, here's the CA you use. Should you check that the serving certificate? Should you check the name on the serving certificate? And if so, what name should it be? That sort of stuff.
I guess Rob, could this be replicated with the service policy stuff, or is this require a different API shape?
I think John.
I mean, this might be like, hey, it's not going to go in V1 beta 1, but it's very close, like,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a key question, right? Where does this live? It is, I think somewhere in this thread, John had mentioned, well, it's not in, the API itself, but there's nothing saying you can't build some kind of extension, some kind of policy to do it that is vendor specific. That may not be a good enough answer here. I'm not sure. We need to figure out, and I don't think anyone has spent the time to figure out what level of portability is available for this kind of configuration. Can we find, is this the policy resource that really is portable enough across implementations that we can bring it into the API itself? This does feel to me like something like that policy and policy attachment is designed for. It's less clear to me what bits of configuration are truly portable across implementations. But to me, that feels like the best solution, but I don't know that it needs to block, but I don't know, interested in what others think here.
I would say that even if we were going to add something to the API, it would be would need to be an additive change. Like, we'd need to add some spot to put the details, like I'm thinking about what we did for Contour. We literally, in the route, we had a thing in the cluster definition. So like in the sort of the endpoint or the backend definition, we added a spot where you can supply TLS details, and you can supply, a CA, some names and other stuff like that. As you say, that can absolutely be done with policy, but even if we changed our mind and wanted to add that as an actual upstreamable, like an actual upstream field, that would be 100% added, an additive change that would then, if it is not, an optional struct, if you added it, you should enable this behavior. And so, like, if we were going to add it, as you say, Rob, it would make sense for it to be added with extended support. I think the advantage of adding it with extended support later is that then we can mandate how the behavior works, like the expected behavior, rather than if we leave it to policy. One of the downsides of policy is that for this relatively common thing that you want to do, then that means that every implementation may end up making their own thing. And so I think that the reason to do this is that it's pretty common to want to, like, terminate and then re-encrypt. And that if we're going to do that, we should have a way that a common behavior across as many implementations as possible. And that the way to do that is with a field. We add a field in the future that is an extended support field that then that we do the same stuff we have with other extended fields, which is the plan is, we don't have it yet, but it's planned that, for extended fields, we will have conformance tests that if you have the extended fields enabled, will, if you indicate that you support the extended fields, then the conformance test will test that the extended fields act as we mandate they do.
Yeah, that makes sense. We should just be clear that if it's not that because it's not in the V1 beta 1 that we are sort of like closing the door on the existence of this. It just sounds like this one is a bit more complicated, so it just needs more time to understand.
Yeah, I think both of the features we've talked about today come under that, Jeff.
Yeah, I was just going to basically say the exact same thing. So, that's +1 on my side. You'd say.
And Costin as well. Did you have another thing to add? Yeah, cool. Yeah, so the common extensions thing, that was yours, Costin. Cool. Yeah, so I think the idea for common extensions is for if they are prototyping implementation specific things, the idea is that implementations can say, hey, I think everyone's going to need to do this. You can and should bring that back to the community and say, hey, I think we should add an extended support field here for people who want to do this so that we can all do this in the same way and we can meet our sort of feature portability goals. And both this and the all ports and the sort of the port shenanigans thing feel like things where not everybody's going to be able to do the same thing, but the people who are doing similar things will need to make sure that they behave in the same way. And so that is the definition of what extended level support means. Not everyone does it, but those who do it the same way.
No, I completely agree. That's right, Pat.
Great. I think we have consensus here. I want to make sure. It sounds like we are fine with leaving this out or not blocking the initial beta release for this, but that does not mean this will not eventually make it to the beta API, just it won't be in the first release of V1 beta 1. And there is significant interest in finding common ground among implementations that can support this and implementing that either as an extended field or a common, like a built-in policy resource, but also with extended support. Good. Okay. I'll run with that. This is not in the milestone yet. I will leave it out of the milestone and I will add one more comment. This is 968. I'll add a comment just to clarify the summary of our meeting today. Cool. All right. So let me actually look at the milestone. My other questions are really about the the issues that I have in here right now. Is anyone aware of anything that we should have in this milestone that, really needs to get done before we release that is not right now? Are there things that we really should be covering before this initial beta release?
I would say the only thing that I can think of that we don't have an explicit issue for is that if people, if anyone has some bandwidth, I'm probably not going to get to this because I got to do all the webhook stuff. But if anyone has some bandwidth and would like to have a look at things, if you could go over like some of the behavior in the objects that we're doing and try and see if we've got conformance tests covering it. I think we've got reasonable conformance test coverage on the HTTP route for the basic functionality that we're talking about. And gateway as well implicitly because of the usage of the HTTP route. But if we don't have any coverage of like collapsing, we don't have much coverage of like merging listeners or other things like that. So if anyone wants to add any of that stuff, it's not a blocker for beta, but the more conformance we have before we go beta, the better. So and I think that having like close to 100% conformance coverage is a requirement for GA in my mind. Maybe not all the way at 100, but close to, for all of the core stuff for sure. And ideally to go to GA, we should have a mechanism for you to say, what extended fields you support. And if so, how you test them, and mandate that conformance behavior like I talked about. There's a lot of work to do to get there though, a lot of work. Sorry, Jeff, you go.
I was just gonna say my engineering team's working on adding some conformance tests or validation tests right now. And so over the next 6 weeks, probably, we should be able to contribute a fair amount. But we'd like to not be the only team that contributes from where we're at right now. So I don't want to be promised. I don't want people to think that that our engineering team is signing up to do all of it, all that's left.
Yeah, one of the things that I do want to do actually is to make it so that we have. I would like to have, and this is part of my to-do list for the webhook, is I would like to have there be some conformance tests of the webhook. So I think, Rob, did you do a PR for that already?
A variation of that. So it does not cover conformance tests, but we do have E2E testing now where our examples run through that validation. So we have some coverage, but I'd love more. And I think
what I want to see, and the reason I want to have conformance tests for that, in addition to the end-to-end test that Rob is talking about. So yes, I'll explain the conformance test in a minute. So for conformance tests, the idea is that similar to upstream, we want to have a way for implementations to say we are a conformant gateway API implementation. We conform to the standard parts. And the way to do that is to have a series of tests that you can run against your implementation that will basically, if they all pass, you are a conformant implementation. There's a lot of complexity there because not everybody has to implement all of the API in like at least 2 dimensions, being like core and extended stuff. And then you don't have to support all of the objects. You do have to support gateway, class, and gateway, but you don't have to support gateway API / conformance is the starting point. And so the thing that I want to have it be is that we run the webhook conformance so that to validate that your implementation is installing either the webhook that we like the binary webhook that we provide as an emission webhook, or you're providing something that provides the same level of functionality, which means that if you are doing something clever and you want to add some additional stuff on top of the webhook that the upstream project provide, that's 100% fine. The conformance test will pass. The webhook, the validation will be like, yes, thumbs up. Stuff that should be rejected by the validating webhook is rejected, but you're free to do that in any way you see fit, as long with what we're doing is defining the testing to say this is what we mean by validation, and that means that in my mind we want to have extremely close to 100% on the conformance testing for the webhook, because the reason we have the webhook is that the Q-builder validations you have are very important in some cases for security reasons, but you can't mandate that the Q-builder, that the open API validations always happen. If nothing else, you can kubectl apply -- force and just ignore them if you want. And so like having an admission webhook, a validating admission webhook means that the API server will not accept those things, and you can't force your way past it without disabling the webhook. And so that's why I want to have the conformance tests for the thing. So yeah, I think hopefully I explained by what I meant by conformance tests. And there's so much work to do there. If anyone else is interested in this area at all, it's probably been my baby a little bit at the moment, but one of the things I would like to see us do at some point in the future is have like conformance profiles that sort of define, like, right now, a lot of what the first round of beta objects are effectively an ingress controller, like effectively replicates what you would call an ingress controller currently that reconciles the ingress object. But like, there's no reason why you have to do that use case. So like, if you're writing a layer 4 load balancer only that doesn't do layer 7, right now the conformance test will fail for you because you're not doing H2P route. So there needs to be a way for us to have conformance profiles that you can say, I support these objects and the behavior for these is conformant. But right, we have no mechanism to do that, and there's heaps of work to do that. So
yeah, great points. I just want to echo that last one. Just the idea that we have endless amounts of work that can be done. If you have any extra cycles and want to contribute, want to get involved, I think we have some issues tagged that way, but also just reach out in Slack, SIG Network Gateway API channel. I think that's linked on our website too. We will be more than happy to provide ideas with how you can get started depending on your interest level.
Yeah, and obviously your skill set as well. If you want to, if you are not 100% cool with writing heaps of Go code, that is 100% fine. There's a lot of work to do in just thinking about like how we define this and writing documents to explain it to everybody and making plans and stuff like that. There's heaps of work there to just doing that, even before any coding happens. So there's plenty to do.
Just to be conscious of time, we are running out. I do want to, I think the answer to anything else missing is no, but if we have time, conformance tests would be great, more conformance tests. And it sounds like that's in work progress, so great. The next follow-up question is if there's any hesitation with handing over the current API as it exists today, basically for SIG network API review. So with the idea that we want to ship what exists in V1 Alpha 2 as V1 Beta 1 in the next few weeks. And we want SIG network API reviewers to review the API as it exists today. Any hesitation with that?
I am +1 to just getting it reviewed.
Cool. Got a +1 from Bowie in chat, and other people seem in agreement. Definitely, if you have any hesitation, again, drop something in Slack or on GitHub, but otherwise within the next 24 hours or so, I'll assume consensus and we'll move on from there, and I'll reach out to our SIG network API reviewers. I think that's Tim, Cal, and Dan right now. And I'll hand this off to them. It is near upstream code freeze time, so it's going to be busy for them. I don't know what kind of turnaround we'll get from them, but again, just I want to make sure we're confident with the API we have and good to hand it off.
So yeah, I think Candace had a thing in there that she thought we'd already done that. So we did it for Alpha 1. We did it for like releasing an actual alpha under the Kubernetes API, but because we are using the Kubernetes.io API group, every time we do an API rev, we have to do another round of API rev. So reasons not to do an API rev is ++.
We're special. We get to do 2 rounds of API review. We have all of us reviewing our own API, and then we get to send it off to another level for a second set of API review. So hopefully that makes our API extra special. I don't know. With that, I think, Nick, you've got the next one. CRD.
This is a very quick FYI. There's I'm helping some other folk at VMware work on this KEP API machinery KEP to add a mechanism to the CRD object itself, the actual object that defines CRDs, that you can do per field level feature gates. So you can have the feature present in the field present in the CRD definition, and then the API server, and then a way to say this field is experimental, and then there will be a mechanism for operators to say, unless I opt into this, then the field will do nothing. That is the same mechanism. Basically, the idea is to replicate the same mechanism that the upstream objects like ingress or service or something like that have with feature gates to the API server, so that there's a way for you to try it out and for the code to be present without it impacting production users until we're confident that the production users are good. So yeah, basically, I just wanted to give everyone a heads up that this KEP is coming. When it is delivered, it will be quite useful.
Yeah, thank you. I took a look at this, and it just made me sad that it didn't exist when we were starting this API. It looks awesome. I'm excited to see it actually working. But yeah, thanks for the heads up. Maybe at some point in the future we can transition to this. I don't know. But
this would effectively replace the current experimental stable CRD definition we have at a much more granular and flexible level. So it's just going to be a straight upgrade.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a positive for us. For now, I think the experimental stable is probably sufficient. But as we get more and more feature requests, we're really going to want something like this, which is per feature. So hopefully the timing works out for that. Next one on the list, I think Jeff or Mike, either one of you, I just want to make sure we hadn't dropped the ball. Do you need anything from us for route delegation? Like, are you waiting for a review or anything that we could help with?
So I'm just about ready to actually file the GEP. And I actually have a couple of questions about that for, maybe you, Rob, or Nick, if you could stay on after we're kind of done and stop recording. The only major thing outstanding is defining how route status works, and
That's on me.
Yeah, and which Nick has stepped up to volunteer to do. And the GEP will incorporate some of the feedback from all the discussion and stuff. So I think I should have that. I don't get it up today. I think I'll get, or if not tonight, I think I'll get it up tomorrow, by the end of my day tomorrow, probably.
Yeah, I will try and have a rough cut of something about status available for you to check out, Jeff, in the next couple of days. I'll just do that in a separate ACMD or something like that, so then you can just fold it straight into the GEP once we open it. Feel free to just in your GEP just put like route status pending Nick. Yeah. Okay, with it again.
I'll remember to stay on after this.
Thanks
for any open discussion. Thank you again for the work on that. And to anyone on this call, I know all of us tend to forget things. If there are PRs that we have just neglected, it's not intentional. So please just ping us like on Slack, wherever. It's not that we're intentionally trying to avoid reviewing something. It's just that it got dropped off of the list in, the queue in my mind. That's it has a short list and can only hold so much. With that, one last thing, I added a PR. This is an old issue that came out of the last API review. It was, hey, why don't we this host name intersection thing between HTTP and TLS route and gateway is confusing. Why don't we drop something in status so it's a little bit more obvious what is actually being used here? That just kind of sat neglected, and then it's I think it got marked stale sometime over the weekend, and Nick picked it up, and I thought, oh, this will be an easy change. It ended up being larger than expected. Sorry. So I am not tied to getting this in, but it is here. I think it is a net positive. I will not be offended if someone wants to hold off on this. It does have the one LGTM right now. I want to wait till it has at least one more before going ahead with it. But if anyone is at all hesitant, I'm fine to block. I'm fine to just leave this off of the next release. So any strong opinions? This is, I think, the most recent PR, 1055. Just add them there. But otherwise, I'm hoping this is a fairly straightforward change. I apologize to anyone implementing the API because it adds yet another level of struct nesting, just the inline type that is annoying to work with, but otherwise, I think it's fairly straightforward. So I think that's all we have time for today. We've gone over yet again. Thank you to everyone for sticking with us. Is there anything I missed that we should really cover in this meeting before we call it?
I'd just like to say thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks for the great chat and questions and everything. Yeah, these meetings are super useful. Thank you.
Yeah, completely agree. I'm going to stop recording, and anyone can stay on for more informal discussion afterwards.